Picture this. You're a lady-in-waiting, standing beside a dying queen's bed at Sudeley Castle in September 1548, and the words coming from her fever-cracked lips make your blood run cold. Catherine Parr, the woman who survived Henry VIII when 5 other queens could not, is dying just 6 days after giving birth to her first child. But it's not the childbed fever that terrifies you. It's what she's confessing in her delirium. "I am not well handled," she whispers, her eyes wild with pain and something darker. "Those that be about me careth not for me, but standeth laughing at my grief." Her trembling finger points toward the door, where her husband Thomas Seymour paces like a caged wolf. You realize you're witnessing the final moments of a woman who discovered too late that the man she loved more than life itself had been using her as a stepping stone to something far more sinister. The Queen's voice drops to a barely audible whisper. "He would have given 1,000 marks to have had my full talk with my physician the first day I was delivered, but I durst not for displeasing him." Your hands shake as you lean closer, understanding that you're hearing the last words of a woman who may have been silenced forever by the very man who claimed to love her. Before diving into this forgotten story of love, betrayal and murder that nearly destroyed the future Elizabeth I, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the stories that shaped our past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Tudor drama. It's the story of how England's most educated queen became the victim of a predator who groomed not just her, but the future Elizabeth I herself. It's about a woman whose brilliant mind couldn't save her from a man who saw her wealth, her royal connections, and her vulnerable stepdaughter as tools for his own twisted ambitions. The name Catherine Parr might be familiar as Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, the one who survived. But survival, as you'll discover, is a relative term when the real monster enters your life after the tyrant king is already dead. Let's start with a love story that began in 1543, because even the darkest tragedies often begin with hope and romance. Catherine Parr was not born to be queen. She was born to be extraordinary in ways that transcended royal titles. At 31, she was already a twice-widowed woman of remarkable intelligence and education, fluent in French, Italian and Latin, with a passion for religious reform that would make her dangerous enemies at court. She first met Thomas Seymour in the corridors of power surrounding Princess Mary's household, where Catherine served as a companion and intellectual influence. Thomas was everything a woman might dream of in 1543, devastatingly handsome, charming beyond measure, and connected to the very heart of royal power as brother to Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's beloved third wife, who had died giving birth to Prince Edward. The attraction between Catherine and Thomas was immediate and intense. Here was a man who seemed to appreciate her mind as much as her beauty, who could match her wit in conversation and shared her Protestant faith. Thomas was ambitious, yes, but so were all men at Henry's court. Catherine saw his ambition as drive, his charm as genuine affection, his attention as the love she had never found in her previous marriages of convenience. They began to plan a future together, Catherine finally believing she could marry for love rather than duty. Thomas courted her with poetry and passionate letters, promising her a partnership of equals in a world where women were typically treated as property. For a few precious months, Catherine Parr thought she had found her fairy tale ending. But fairy tales rarely survive collision with reality, especially in Tudor England. Henry VIII, that aging monster whose cruelty had already consumed 5 wives, noticed the intelligent, gracious woman who attended his daughter Mary. Catherine Parr was everything his previous wife, the teenage Catherine Howard, had not been: mature, educated, diplomatic, and most importantly, unlikely to embarrass him with the kind of sexual scandal that had cost Howard her head. When the King of England decided he wanted you, refusal wasn't truly an option. Catherine found herself facing an impossible choice: marry the man she loved and risk royal displeasure that could destroy both their lives, or accept Henry's proposal and sacrifice her personal happiness for safety and position. The decision was made for her when Thomas Seymour was suddenly given a diplomatic posting in Brussels, a transparent move to remove him from court while Henry completed his courtship. Catherine understood the message. She could have Thomas Seymour's love or her life, but not both. On July 12, 1543, Catherine Parr became Queen of England in a quiet ceremony that must have felt more like a funeral for her dreams than a wedding celebration. She was marrying a man 30 years her senior, grossly overweight, chronically ill, and infamous for his treatment of wives who displeased him. Thomas Seymour watched from a distance as the woman he loved disappeared into the golden cage of queenship. But Catherine Parr was not just another victim of Henry VIII's desires. She possessed something her predecessors had lacked, the political intelligence to survive. She understood that Henry, for all his monstrous reputation, was fundamentally a lonely, aging, insecure man who craved intellectual companionship as much as physical comfort. Catherine gave him what he needed. She discussed theology and philosophy with him, managing to advocate for Protestant reform without triggering his explosive temper. She became a mediator between Henry and his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, helping to heal family wounds that had festered for years. Most importantly, she learned to disagree with him in ways that felt like conversations rather than challenges to his authority. The strategy worked. Henry VIII, who had executed wives for adultery and treason, came to trust Catherine Parr so completely that he named her Regent of England when he left to campaign in France. For the first time in his reign, Henry had found a wife who was truly his partner rather than his victim. Catherine's influence on the young Elizabeth during these years cannot be overstated. The future queen was 10 years old when Catherine became her stepmother, a brilliant but traumatized child who had watched her father execute her mother and spend years declaring her illegitimate. Catherine saw past Elizabeth's defensive walls to the extraordinary mind beneath, providing the kind of educational opportunities and emotional stability that would shape the girl into one of history's greatest monarchs. Under Catherine's guidance, Elizabeth mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. More importantly, she learned from Catherine's example how an intelligent woman could wield influence in a world dominated by men. Catherine showed Elizabeth that learning was not just decoration for a lady, but a weapon that could be used to survive and thrive in the most dangerous circumstances. The relationship between Catherine and Elizabeth went beyond education to genuine maternal affection. Catherine provided the love and guidance that Elizabeth's own mother had been unable to give, creating a bond that would influence Elizabeth's entire approach to queenship. When people marvel at Elizabeth I's intelligence, her diplomatic skills, her ability to inspire loyalty while maintaining independence, they're seeing the fruits of Catherine Parr's influence. But Catherine's success as queen came with a terrible price, the complete sacrifice of her personal happiness. While she played her role perfectly in public, privately, she grieved for the love she had lost. Thomas Seymour remained in Brussels, sending occasional letters that had to be carefully worded to avoid suspicion of treason. Catherine had saved her life by accepting Henry's proposal, but in doing so, she had condemned herself to emotional imprisonment. The psychological toll of this sacrifice was enormous. Catherine had to smile lovingly at a husband whose touch repulsed her, had to be grateful for the honour of marriage to a man who could have her killed for any perceived slight, had to present herself as the happiest woman in England while her heart slowly died inside. Henry's death in January 1547 should have been Catherine's liberation, but liberation from one prison often leads directly to another. At 35, Catherine was wealthy, titled, and finally free to make her own choices. The first choice she made would destroy everything she had worked to build. Within weeks of Henry's funeral, Thomas Seymour returned to England. He was no longer the charming courtier Catherine remembered. Power had changed him, or perhaps revealed what had always been beneath the surface. As uncle to the new King Edward VI and brother to the Lord Protector, Thomas had tasted real political influence and found it intoxicating. When he approached Catherine about reviving their romance, she should have been cautious. She was the Queen Dowager, one of the most important women in England, with responsibilities to her stepchildren and her own reputation. Marriage to anyone would be controversial so soon after Henry's death, but marriage to Thomas Seymour, ambitious, landless and jealous of his brother's greater power, was political suicide. But Catherine Parr had been emotionally starved for 4 years. The man she had loved and lost was standing before her, telling her all the things she had dreamed of hearing, promising her the partnership and passion she had sacrificed for duty. Her rational mind, so sharp in every other area, was completely overwhelmed by her emotional needs. They married in secret in May 1547, less than 4 months after Henry's death. The haste was shocking even by Tudor standards, where royal widows typically observed at least a year of mourning before remarrying. Catherine's reputation, so carefully built over years of perfect queenly behaviour, was severely damaged by what appeared to be unseemly lust for a man her social inferior. But Catherine was beyond caring about reputation. For the first time in her adult life, she was married to a man she had chosen, a man who claimed to love her as passionately as she loved him. She moved to Chelsea Manor with her household, which included her beloved stepdaughter Elizabeth, ready to finally experience the happiness that had been denied her for so long. The signs that something was wrong began almost immediately, though Catherine's love blindness prevented her from seeing them clearly. Thomas's behaviour toward 14-year-old Elizabeth was inappropriate from the start. Morning visits to her bedchamber while she was still in her nightgown, playful wrestling that left the girl flustered and confused, comments about her developing beauty that crossed the line from avuncular to predatory. Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, raised concerns about Thomas's conduct, but her warnings were dismissed. Catherine herself participated in some of these games, holding Elizabeth down while Thomas cut her black mourning dress to shreds with scissors, laughing at the girl's obvious discomfort, and treating her protests as childish modesty rather than genuine distress. Looking back, it's clear that Thomas Seymour was systematically grooming both Catherine and Elizabeth, but grooming looked different in 1547 than it does today. Physical affection between adults and children was more common, boundaries were less clearly defined, and a man's authority over his household was largely absolute. Thomas was skilled at making his inappropriate behaviour seem like harmless family fun, convincing even Catherine that his interest in Elizabeth was purely paternal. But Thomas's real target was never just sexual gratification. It was power. Elizabeth Tudor was second in line to the English throne after her half-sister Mary. If Thomas could marry Elizabeth, he would be positioned to become king consort if she inherited. The grooming wasn't just about satisfying his desires, it was about positioning himself for the ultimate political prize. Catherine, pregnant for the first time at age 36, was initially too happy to see the signs. She was finally experiencing the love and passion she had craved, finally building the family she had dreamed of. The idea that her husband might be using both her and her stepdaughter as tools for his own advancement was too horrible to contemplate. The moment of truth came in the summer of 1548. Catherine, heavily pregnant and increasingly suspicious of her husband's behaviour, walked into a room and found Thomas and Elizabeth in what witnesses described as an embrace that left no doubt about Thomas's intentions. The sight of her husband holding her 15-year-old stepdaughter, a girl Catherine loved like a daughter, in a clearly sexual manner shattered every illusion Catherine had maintained about her marriage. The confrontation that followed was devastating. Catherine accused Thomas not just of inappropriate behaviour, but of using her to get close to Elizabeth, of marrying her not for love, but for access to the girl who might one day be queen. Thomas's response was to accuse Catherine of jealousy and paranoia, to gaslight her into believing she was imagining things that she had seen with her own eyes. But Catherine Parr was too intelligent to be manipulated for long. She immediately sent Elizabeth away from the household, officially for the girl's own reputation, but really to protect her from further abuse. The damage to the relationship between Catherine and Elizabeth was immediate and heartbreaking. The girl Catherine had raised and loved now seemed complicit in betraying her trust. Elizabeth, for her part, was trapped in an impossible situation. At 15, she was old enough to understand the political implications of Thomas's attention, but young enough to be confused by the sexual dimension. She had lost her father, been separated from the stepmother who had provided stability and love, and now found herself the centre of a scandal that could destroy her chances of inheriting the throne. The trauma of this period would mark Elizabeth for life. Her later refusal to marry, her complex relationships with men, her ability to use her sexuality as a political tool while maintaining her physical independence. All of these can be traced back to her experiences with Thomas Seymour and the painful lesson that even those who claim to love her might be using her for their own purposes. For Catherine, the revelation of Thomas's true nature was devastating beyond measure. She had sacrificed everything for this love: her reputation, her relationships with her stepchildren, her position at court. She had endured 4 years of marriage to Henry VIII, believing that her reward would be a lifetime of happiness with Thomas Seymour. Instead, she discovered that the man she adored saw her primarily as a means to access a teenage girl. The remaining months of Catherine's pregnancy were a nightmare of suspicion and betrayal. Thomas continued to insist that Catherine was imagining things, that his behaviour toward Elizabeth had been misinterpreted. He pointed out that Catherine was pregnant and emotional, suggesting that her hormones were making her paranoid and jealous. But Catherine had not survived Henry VIII by being naive about men's capacity for deception. She began to see Thomas's behaviour in a new light, the way he had pushed for the hasty marriage, his insistence on bringing Elizabeth into their household, his cultivation of relationships with other powerful courtiers, while claiming to be devoted to domestic happiness. She realized that Thomas Seymour had never loved her at all. He had loved her connections, her wealth, her status as Queen Dowager, and most of all, her access to Elizabeth Tudor. Catherine Parr, the brilliant woman who had outwitted one of history's most dangerous kings, had been completely fooled by a charming sociopath who saw her as nothing more than a tool for his advancement. The birth of Catherine's daughter Mary in August 1548 should have been the happiest moment of her life. Instead, it marked the beginning of her final torment. Within days of the delivery, Catherine developed childbed fever, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in the era before antibiotics. But even as fever ravaged her body, Catherine's mind remained sharp enough to see the truth about her situation. Thomas, who should have been devastated by his wife's illness, seemed more concerned with the political opportunities her death might create. He hovered around her sickbed not like a grieving husband, but like a vulture waiting for carrion. In her delirium, Catherine spoke truths she had been too polite to voice while healthy. She accused Thomas of poor treatment, of caring more about his ambitions than her welfare. Most damningly, she revealed that he had prevented her from consulting with her own physician in the critical days after delivery, possibly contributing to the infection that was killing her. Lady Elizabeth Tudor, who attended Catherine during her final days, recorded the dying Queen's words with shocking honesty. Catherine accused those around her of laughing at her grief, of caring nothing for her suffering. When Thomas lay down beside her to comfort her, she turned on him with accusations that cut to the heart of their relationship. "My lord, I would have given 1,000 marks to have had my full talk with my physician the first day I was delivered, but I durst not for displeasing you," Catherine whispered. The implication was clear. Thomas had controlled even her medical care, prioritizing his own convenience over her health and possibly her life. Some historians have suggested that Thomas Seymour deliberately prevented Catherine from receiving proper medical care, possibly even poisoning her to clear the way for his pursuit of Elizabeth. While definitive proof is lacking, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Catherine's death, her rapid decline, Thomas's strange behaviour, the secretive nature of her funeral, have fueled centuries of speculation about whether England's most educated queen was murdered by the man she loved. Catherine Parr died on September 5, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth to her only child. She was 36 years old, in the prime of her life, with so much still to contribute to the world. Her death was officially attributed to childbed fever, but the testimony of those who witnessed her final days suggests a more complex and sinister truth. Thomas Seymour's behaviour after Catherine's death was telling. Rather than grieving for his wife, he immediately began plotting to marry Elizabeth Tudor, despite her being only 15 years old and his own stepdaughter. When Elizabeth wisely refused his advances and returned to court, Thomas's desperation led him to increasingly reckless behaviour. In January 1549, just 4 months after Catherine's death, Thomas was caught attempting to break into the young King Edward's bedchambers at Hampton Court Palace with a loaded pistol. His exact intentions remain unclear, but the implications were terrifying. Was he planning to kidnap the king, assassinate him, or force him to approve a marriage to Elizabeth? Thomas Seymour was arrested, charged with 33 counts of treason, and executed on March 20th, 1549. His death was ordered by his own brother, the Lord Protector, who finally recognised the danger Thomas posed to the realm. In the end, Thomas's charm and ambition had carried him exactly where they inevitably led, to the executioner's block. The tragedy of Catherine Parr's story lies not just in her death, but in the complete betrayal of everything she believed about love and marriage. She had been one of the most powerful women in Europe, advisor to kings and educator of future queens. Her intelligence and political acumen had saved her life multiple times in the deadly arena of Tudor politics. But none of that wisdom could protect her from the universal human need for love and connection. Thomas Seymour understood that need and exploited it ruthlessly, convincing Catherine that he loved her while systematically planning to use her as a stepping stone to greater power. Catherine's story is a reminder that intelligence and education are not always enough to protect us from predators who understand how to manipulate our deepest emotional needs. The same vulnerability that made Catherine human, her capacity for love, her desire for happiness, her willingness to trust, also made her the perfect victim for a man who saw other people only as tools for his own advancement. The impact of Catherine's tragedy extended far beyond her own life. Elizabeth Tudor, traumatized by the scandal and her stepmother's death, would spend the rest of her life guarding against the kind of manipulation that had destroyed Catherine. Elizabeth's famous refusal to marry, her complex dance with male courtiers, her ability to use the promise of marriage as a political weapon while never actually surrendering her independence. All of these can be traced back to the lessons she learned watching Catherine Parr's marriage to Thomas Seymour implode. Catherine's daughter Mary disappeared from history shortly after her mother's death, becoming one of Tudor England's most mysterious figures. Some historians believe she died in childhood. Others suggest she was raised in secret and may have lived to adulthood under a different identity. Like so many women in Tudor history, Mary Seymour was erased from the record, her fate deemed less important than the political machinations of the men who shaped her world. But Catherine Parr's intellectual legacy lived on through Elizabeth I, who would become everything Catherine had dreamed of being. A woman who wielded absolute power while maintaining her personal independence, who promoted learning and religious reform, who proved that intelligence and political skill could triumph over the limitations imposed by gender. When Elizabeth I spoke of not wanting to marry because she feared losing her independence to a husband, she was channeling lessons learned from watching Catherine Parr's brilliant mind and strong will be systematically undermined by a man who claimed to love her. When Elizabeth used her education and linguistic skills to outmaneuver male opponents, she was using tools Catherine had given her. Catherine Parr deserves to be remembered not just as Henry VIII's sixth wife or as the queen who survived. She should be remembered as a woman whose intellectual achievements and educational innovations shaped the future of England, whose influence on Elizabeth I helped create one of history's greatest monarchs. But she should also be remembered as a victim, a woman whose emotional needs were exploited by a predator who understood exactly how to manipulate her intelligence, her loneliness, and her capacity for love. Catherine's story is both a celebration of female achievement and a warning about the ways that even the strongest women can be destroyed by men who see them as objects rather than human beings. The next time you read about Elizabeth I's remarkable reign, remember Catherine Parr, the stepmother who taught her that knowledge was power, that independence was precious, and that love without respect was not love at all. Catherine paid for those lessons with her life, but her legacy lived on in the woman who would become England's greatest queen. Catherine Parr's tomb at Sudeley Castle bears a simple inscription that hardly does justice to her remarkable life and tragic death. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Catherine is the reign of Elizabeth I, a woman who learned from her stepmother's mistakes and triumphed where Catherine had been destroyed. In the end, Catherine Parr's greatest achievement may not have been surviving Henry VIII, but preparing Elizabeth Tudor to survive everything that followed. The girl who watched her beloved stepmother die from a broken heart and childbed fever grew up to become the Virgin Queen, a woman who would never allow any man to have the power to destroy her the way Thomas Seymour destroyed Catherine Parr. What are your thoughts on this tragic story of love and betrayal? Have you ever found yourself wondering how different history might have been if Catherine Parr had lived to guide Elizabeth I through her early years as Queen? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives on these forgotten corners of history that shaped our world.